This is Marketing Uncomplicated. Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today I have Jeff Greenfield, who is an entrepreneur, advisor, and a disruptor with 3 decades of strategy, growth, and marketing leadership. Jeff is currently building the next generation of AI-driven attribution as the co-founder and CEO of Provalytics. And for those of you who don't know what attribution is, we'll definitely dig into that. So Provalytics is a cookie-less attribution and measurement solution which enables marketers to prove the impact from the upper funnel channels, fantastic, like CTV, and grow their budgets. Welcome to the show, Jeff. It's so good to have you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Sasha. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. And I want to start, as I do mostly with a lot of the guests that I have on, is talk a little bit about their past and kind of what they did to get to where they are today. And I think that you have a wonderful story. So I want to dive into that. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm Jeff Greenfield. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Provalytics. And, I'm in the measurement space, which is numbers, which really doesn't seem to be that sexy because it kind of comes off as math. But I am kind of in the middle of things at this juxtaposition between finance and marketing. So I get to see a lot that's going on, but I didn't, as you just said, I definitely didn't plan this.
Yeah.
It just kind of happened on its own. I went to college. I went to University of Maryland and did my undergraduate and studied biochemistry. And all throughout high school, I had done magic, close-up magic. And it was always my dream to work at this private club in Hollywood called the Magic Castle. But that's where like the top tier magicians work at. And so I was trying to decide what I was going to do, whether I was going to go to medical school. And then someone suggested, why don't you think about becoming a chiropractor? Because I had always gone to chiropractors and I thought, well, this is great because chiropractors use their hands. I do close-up magic. It seemed to be like a kind of a perfect combination. And it turns out that there was a chiropractic college in Los Angeles, which is right near Hollywood.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, this is an excuse for me to move to California and maybe get a chance to work there. So I actually moved to California and went to chiropractic college. And while I was there, to support myself, I started doing magic in Southern California and eventually was able to get recognized and get a job working at the Magic Castle. So that was like a huge, massive achievement for me. Very, very exciting. And so magic has always been part of my life. I think every kid goes through a magic phase, especially boys do. And I just never got out of it. It was just exciting for me. So I thought that I was going to be a chiropractor the rest of my life. I met my wife in Southern California, actually, while I was doing magic.
Okay.
She came into a restaurant that I was working at for her 22nd birthday. And I did my best trick ever and picked up on her. And
you have to tell us what the best trick ever was.
Well, it was a trick that involved cards, but the trick behind the card trick was I got her to write her name and phone number on a card. So that was the trick. And I've been doing that trick for years. In fact, I would go through several decks of cards a week because there wasn't a card left that didn't have a phone number on it. But I never called anyone ever. And I told the waitress that night that I was going to call her. And she's like, yeah, you always say that. And I got home at night and it's like midnight. And I'm like trying to, decide, am I actually going to do this? Because I felt like you were like breaking a barrier, that, there was this implied contract. I'm going to put my name and phone number on here, but no one's actually going to call that number. And I actually did and then asked her out. And that was, almost 40 years ago now. So.
Wow.
So that was the best trick ever.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So she was from New England. So we moved back to New England. I opened up a practice and I had an office in my house and I was off and running on my career. And I thought that was going to be it. I loved being in the healthcare field and taking care of patients. That was what I lived for. And it was great because I still did magic around the office because we took care of a lot of kids, but I was using my hands every day. So to me, that was important. And then I was involved in a car accident. It wasn't that bad, but my elbow got jammed into the door and it crushed my ulnar nerve, which is your funny bone nerve, which you kind of need to use your hand. And I'm left-handed. It was on my left arm. And I needed to go have surgery. So I hired some folks to work for me. And then it turned out the surgery didn't work, that things were kind of beyond repair with that nerve. And I couldn't take care of patients anymore. So I was really unhappy. I was like 29, 30 and really had no idea what I was going to do.
Yeah.
I hired a bunch of people to work for me, but I wasn't ready for that. I had no management experience whatsoever. And I was very unhappy and kind of got out. And my wife said, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I don't know. I think I just need to kind of figure things out. I think I'm going to go back and do magic again. So I went out and I found out that there was this organization at all these colleges. Like when you go to college, there's always entertainers that come on campus, and it's all part of that student activities fee that you pay. And every year in the summer, there's these conferences where all of the students from the student activities departments get together and they book all of these entertainers and speakers and bands. And so I got involved in that organization and was chosen to do a performance at all of them. And so as I was planning towards this, there was a magazine that you could buy an ad in that showed up at each one of these. And
Yeah.
this is like 95. So I'm like, there's this new thing called the internet
Yeah.
and I need to have a website. So I saw an ad in the newspaper. They were advertising that they were doing websites now. And I went in and told them what I needed. They said, come back in a week. And they said, we bought this domain, magic-magic.com. And they showed me some clip art that they made, like a hat with a rabbit, typical what you would
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
for magic. And we're working on this. And they gave me the domain name, magic-magic. So I went and I bought the ads with magic-magic. And I thought, this is going to put me ahead of everyone. I'm so excited. And as we got further along into the summer, I wasn't seeing much progress from them. And it was about 2 weeks before the first conference. And they called me in and they gave me back my check.
Oh.
And I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, well, listen, this is new. We don't really know how to do this. And I'm like, well, listen, I already bought the ad. We have to do something. Like, what can I do? And they're like, well, there's this program called Microsoft Front Page. It's like $399. You can get it at Staples. And the closest Staples was an hour and a half away.
Wow.
And if you can figure it out, let us know because we're still having difficulty. So I was like, oh my God. So I got in my car. I drove to Staples,
Yeah.
bought this huge software. It was like a, the floppy drive thing with a
Yeah.
huge book.
Yeah.
And I did something I've never done since then. I did every single tutorial, every single one of them. And by the end of that weekend, I had a website. I had built the whole thing. And since I built it, I knew how to update it. So every week when I would go to a new conference, I would update the website. And people were starting to notice, my God, your website, it's up to date. And I'm like, yeah. And then eventually, after a couple of months of performances, people asked me, hey, who's your webmaster? Because we need help. And I would explain to them, well, I'm my own webmaster. And they're like, can you help me? And I'm like, sure, I can, but this is not what I'm doing. And I would tell them my whole story. I was a chiropractor. I got injured. I'm on this road to discover what I'm going to do next. And of course, what ended up happening is after a year or so of being on the road and traveling to most colleges in the US, like pretty much every single college in the Midwest, I've done at least 2 or 3 times, like South Dakota State University, Fargo, all of them. And I was able to then eventually build up this consulting practice of all these website design clients that I had because they also needed branding work. And now I was living the entrepreneurial dream of working in my unheated basement. I mean, the only heat I had down there was when the dryer ran. So it was exciting because I was able to be home, which is what I wanted to do. And so I started building that up and I started doing branding work for my clients, helping them kind of rewrite their bios and trying to figure out what it is that they did, what it is that they sold. And then after that, the next thing that clients wanted is they're like, listen, this is great that I have this website, but how do I get to the top of the search engines? And at the time, the top search engine was altavista.com. And then there was go.com and the Yahoo directory. So I started looking into that and I teamed up with a programmer overseas and we built one of the first SaaS automated SEO platforms. And we did this at the time, right as
That's
real
pretty
estate.
cool because that was pretty early on, like to be able to do something like that,
Yeah, it was
especially
like,
for SEO.
yeah, this was like 97, 98. And it was
That's
right when the real estate market was coming on board. And we got very, they always talk about, what is it? Is it hard work or luck? We got very lucky one of our first real estate clients was a gentleman who was running these real estate marketing webinars or seminars for real estate agents to get online. And he became an affiliate. And every weekend we could see the orders come in as he talked about us. And then also the other industry that was coming online was the legal industry as well. So we kind of took off in both of those spaces. And so it was great. I had these kind of two businesses going, but I started getting a little bored and itchy because I'm in my basement, and it was like a year before I'm like performing for hundreds of people every single night at colleges. So it's not as exciting. It's not sexy. And so I called a couple of friends in LA and to find out, what's the latest in the entertainment industry. And I started hearing from a couple different sources. There's this new thing that's been around, but it's pretty cool, called product placement, which is getting products into film, into TV. And I thought that's pretty cool. So I actually...
What year was this, by the way?
What's that?
What year was this?
This is around 99, 2000. So I ordered Yellow Pages from LA. And then I looked up, and there were people listed for product placement in the LA Yellow Pages. And these were like very experienced set designers. So they knew how to get stuff on set. But when I started asking them questions about like, well, can you put together a report once you get something into a TV episode in terms of like how many impressions and what the value was? And they were like, no. We get it on the set. We get it in the show. That's it. And I'm like, okay, well, it seemed like there was an opportunity there. Yeah. So I decided that I wanted to enter that space.
Because you were looking to like monetize further so you could prove point that product placement could generate X, right?
Exactly. Well, but just being able to provide a layer, because I felt as though, and it turned out to be true, that 99% of the products in TV and film are not sponsored. They're just there. Oh yeah.
Even today though?
Even today, yeah. They have to actually go out and pay for the product, and then they have to get clearance for it. So when a brand...
product, just not to interrupt you, but some of the larger like box office like tickets, do you think people, or maybe this, do they buy placement?
Well,
like a Volvo or like some of those.
Well, there's lots of different levels, because now you're talking about branded entertainment where you're saying, hey, we want to be part of it. Whereas product placement, it's like for example, if I'm a TV series and I decide I want to have Pepsi, someone's drinking a Pepsi, in order to even have the Pepsi logo on there, we actually have to get legal clearance from the brand. Whereas if they provide it for free, then it's already there. But a lot of products that you see, the series or the movie actually has to go out and buy the stuff or rent it. And then sometimes they do a technique called, they Greek it up, where the logo looks like it's Pepsi, but it's not Pepsi. They change some of the letters on it so that it doesn't look like that actual logo.
Yes.
But the problem is that I decided I want to get into this business, but I knew enough to have a couple phone calls with people, but nobody knew me or who I was. But I knew how to build a website. So I built a website, and I knew how to get to the top of the search engine. So I hired some writers to write articles about product placement and quote me in them. And then I use those articles to get to the tops of the search engines. And in about 3 months, anytime you search for product placement, I was the go-to person. So now the press started using me in their quotes, and then clients started to call. And then I started speaking at conferences all over the country about product placement, and I became an expert in product placement. And then, so I had clients doing that, but then I had clients that would ask, hey, I want them to hold it longer or say the name. And I'm like, well, that's branded entertainment. You actually have to sponsor like the whole show, which is not like several $100,000, it's several $1 million. And most brands said no to that. But I had several that actually said yes to that. Two of the most exciting, one was a pharmaceutical company that had a sister product to Botox, one of the first fillers, called Restylane. Their biggest competitor was about to enter the market in 6 months. So I created for them one of the first, hotter mom reality TV shows called Hottest Mom in America. That we did the auditions all over the country and then had an online round for that. The end result was we tripled the number of analysts covering the stock, and
I love that.
We increased our market cap by about $500 million.
Wow.
The second most exciting one was a company that most people are familiar with is Verizon Wireless. So back in 2003, all of us were being charged for minutes, not data.
Yep.
but they knew data was the future. They also knew that the segment of the population that used the most data was the African American segment, and where they had the worst market share. So they started investing heavily in multicultural marketing firms. And what they found is every time they invested dollars into a predominantly African American community using a multicultural marketing firm, they would lose market share. So there was a direct correlation. The more money they spent, the more market share they lost, because all they did was they took their normal ads and put people color in them,
Yeah.
and completely not authentic at all to the community.
Yeah.
So I created a American Idol style contest for church choirs, which Verizon sponsored. It was tested in the Memphis market. It was found to be the only program they had ever done that actually increased market share. It toured the entire country. It aired on the Gospel Musical Channel, and it's still running to this day. So that
Amazing.
was, yeah, that was pretty exciting for me. Around that same time, I also had a publicly traded weight loss company that was doing some early branding on this new emerging platform called YouTube. This is around 2006,
Yeah.
2007. Became friendly with the CEO, and he asked me, hey, you know something about digital marketing, which I kind of did. I'd been in this kind of since the beginning. And he's like, can you look at these numbers that I'm getting from my ad agencies? It doesn't seem to make sense. And the numbers didn't make sense at all. And he says, can you take over all of the buying? And I'm like, I'm not a media buyer, but I know who the experts are in the country. I'll hire them and I'll manage the whole team. He said, perfect. So overnight, I became like the agency of record, if you will. And immediately within, let's say a week, I started hearing about these problems. And the first problem that came forward was that all of their digital buys, which was digital advertising like banner ads, they were all being purchased on a CPA basis. So they're paying commission. And the problem was is that for every sale, they were paying out 5 commissions, because the keeper of who was deciding who won that conversion was they were relying on the partners.
Yeah.
And so what that meant is at the end of the day, if you had 1,000 sales, when you add it all up from the partners, they said you had 5,000 sales, and no one was actually doing the math.
Yeah.
And the problem was there was no way to like keep score to figure out who actually won. And at the time I was building out another product. So I took a couple of my developers off of that, and I said, I can figure this out pretty quickly. And so I built out kind of a rudimentary scorekeeper, if you will. And then every week there was another problem that came up. What about this? And what about that? So I kept adding more and more to this. And this is what we used as a team to kind of grow the business for them. And the business for this client grew substantially, all on the direct to consumer side.
Yeah.
And they just started piling more and more money. And as long as we were following the formula from the system that I built, things were flowing perfectly. So I told a couple of friends about it, who said that that was impossible what I had done. And then I realized that what I
Skeptical
had
why?
built,
He was skeptical why? Because it was so
because what I had built was this attribution platform that was able to keep score and to divide things up. And that had been kind of the panacea of digital marketing, if you will, to try to figure out who actually wins the conversion. But not only that, who's actually starting the process from the top down, so you would know where to invest to drive more business through your sales funnel.
Yeah.
And people had been trying to figure that out, but no one had cracked it. And so that's why they kind of called a friend called BS on me. And that's when I realized, I said, well, maybe there's a there. Maybe this is not just a solution for this client. Maybe this is a product for others. So I kind of changed the build to just be for a single client into what we call multi-tenant. To just add another client, I just put in a new name essentially.
Yeah.
And started building that out and started getting other folks to test it. Some other larger advertisers like LifeLock and a couple of others, where I had friends that were working there, and everyone was really kind of shocked by this because this was something completely different than what they had seen. And all of a sudden, this is now early 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
I kind of moved most of my focus into building up what became C3 Metrics, which was one of the first multi-touch attribution companies that focus primarily on larger enterprise advertisers. And I scaled that company up over the next 12 years. And then I exited that company in 2019, right before the pandemic, thinking I was done with measurement.
Yeah.
I actually didn't know what I was going to do. I spent a couple of months relearning how to code again because I hadn't done much coding since before my website days. And
Yeah.
a friend of mine asked me to come on board and build out a new division for his company. He had a much larger company that was in the process of either doing an IPO or being acquired. And I had never worked for anyone in my entire life. I was 55, didn't know what I wanted to do. And my wife said, "Why don't you try it? You've always led teams. You've never been part of a team. Just see what it's like."
Yeah.
And so it felt safe because I knew it was temporary. It was going to be max like a year and a half, maybe 2 years. So I did it and I stayed there for about a year and a half. And what I got to see and what I learned from that is I got to see like the inside. I'd always sold into organizations around that same size. And I got to see all the politics on the inside, stuff I had observed,
Oh, yeah.
but I'd never experienced. So I got to see it. It was kind of wild to
Yeah. It is
actually be
wild.
in the middle of it all versus being on the outside.
Yep.
What I also learned is how to chill out because when I ran C3, it was 24/7. And now Friday rolled around, and I'd shut down my laptop and walk away and say, it feels weird to not think about the company, but it's my friend's company. It's not my company. So
Yeah.
I need to just relax and enjoy the weekend. And I did. And I've kind of taken that and used that as I move forward. So after that, and now we're into early 2022, now there's been all of these changes in the internet and in advertising technology all around privacy. We've got now the CCPA in California, these
Hmm.
privacy regulations that all started with the GDPR and the EU, and everything is shifted now where everything is now privacy focused. And what I had built at C3 was based upon available technology at the time, which was there were no rules. You could collect everything on everyone. There was no privacy regulations whatsoever. But what it meant is that what we were using just a couple of years before to measure ad effectiveness was no longer going to work. We were now living in a world where having that user level data was not going to be available. You couldn't get it anymore. And so there needed to be a new solution. And so but the big difference is that computers were now, now it's 2022, like how much more powerful computers in 2022 versus 2008 or 2009?
Yeah.
Like incredibly more powerful.
Hmm.
So maybe we can do some really cool stuff now. That was my theory that we couldn't do back then, that we could maybe take non-user level data, but be able to get really granular, get to the same level of detail that we got before, but
And even
without,
more detailed.
right, but without violating user privacy. And so I started testing it out with my co-founder, Todd Kirk, and we were both amazed of the stuff that we were able to do. Less data, but still be able to get the same output. And that led us down the path of building out Provalytics, which is what I'm doing today. So, it doesn't seem sexy, but it kind of is, and what's interesting is that when I look through that whole long story that I just went through,
Yeah.
you know, everything to me is all about, I look back to doing magic, magic to me was always, it's always about getting people to think outside the box. And to
Yeah.
me, that process is about, reducing your stress. Like when you're hyper focused on something, you just have to get outside yourself and you can kind of find it. And as a chiropractor, my job was to reduce people's stress on their nervous systems, which is what I did. And so now the role that I'm in now is, marketers really aren't good at math. I mean, even though we say we're data driven marketers, most of us are not. We went to school to learn about being more creative, not to work in spreadsheets.
Yep.
But things have gotten so complicated with marketing today that most marketers use spreadsheets more than most CPAs do. And so with Provalytics, it kind of does the math for the marketer. So it takes some of that stress away. So I'm kind of in the same business, but in a different part. I'm still in the stress reduction business, but helping a specialized group of people that need it.
Yeah, no, fantastic story, Jeff. I mean, thank you. I really appreciate that build up and that trajectory because it's very important to understand, how somebody's kind of lifespan like builds, and like you still have a long way to go in terms of, what you're going to be doing and accomplishing, but also coming from the age of really seeing the internet and marketing really kind of like flip, and kind of grow and really change over time. And being a part of that, I think, is so rich and so endless because so much has changed overnight, really. And now you see the rapid growth that is happening over time so quickly, versus it was moving and kind of shaking, but it wasn't the rapid growth that we're seeing today. And in the beginning, it was almost like when you mentioned, the data like being like the middleman, and like, mathematics and not being so sexy. I do want to drive home the point that data is so important for a business with every move that you make. And even as a marketer, you are one up, to your point. As marketers, we are, more creative, or, we went to school to understand that, but not necessarily look at spreadsheets. But if you have the tacticalness to be able to explain how things are performing and not rely on a third party vendor that you're working with that gives you fluff anyway, that's just 1,000 times more, lucrative to a client to be able to make those chess moves based on the data. And as you and I have talked about in the past, how do we continue as marketers to convince the folks in the finance departments and the CFOs and even the CROs? How do we move forward, and how do we continue to invest in certain channels based on the analytics that's coming through? um, Lots of lifelong stories to come out of, like, all the things that you've done through magic as well, in terms of how, you supported folks, through your chiropractic, and how you're doing that now. It's a beautiful story. But just diving into Provalytics and even further, just from an attribution standpoint, because attribution has changed as well, right? And then even with the data privacy and all of that, once people started to talk about, like, that cookies were going away, marketers started to freak out, because it's like, well, how are we going to track, and dive in deeper into the data and so on and so forth. So I want to hear your point of view, and really how Provalytics is solving for that.
Yeah, it really comes down to the fact that we're kind of living in this world where we're back to the future.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is that before there was digital, all we had in terms of marketing was TV, radio, print, and out of home,
Hmm.
direct mail. That was it.
Hmm.
And what we used to do back in those days is we would launch a campaign, and then we would sit back and kind of sit on our hands. There wasn't much to do. It's like you can't like turn dials on radio to change the radio copy like you can on digital. And the way we would determine whether the campaign was working or not is we would use a technique called marketing mix modeling, where we would look at what is the contribution of the impressions, which are essentially the eyeballs that we're buying and market, to our sales. And that was a statistical technique that's still used today, which is how most of the big brands grew back and have grown throughout the years. You think about something like a BMW or a Pepsi. This is how these brands have grown and continue to grow using this technique. Now, typically, though, these are like big projects where you're looking at like trends over several years, and you use something like marketing mix modeling to set a budget. So it's not as applicable for like what we would consider to be today's attribution. Today's attribution is more, it's supposed to be more flexible, more frequent, and give marketers a level of granularity where it's like campaign, ad group, keyword, match type. So you
Yeah.
know which levers to pull and push. But the problem is that in order to build out a robust attribution model, you have to have access to every bit of that user level data, meaning from that first impression all the way through to that last click. So you can see that whole digital trail. And what's happened is you can't, because some of that data is now living inside of Amazon or Walmart or Facebook, and nobody's talking to each other. So you have all these incomplete journeys that don't actually tell the story. And so we have to kind of step back and say, okay, well, if I can't get the details at that level of granularity, I have to back up. And then before you know it, we're now at that level of marketing mix modeling.
Mhm.
So
And
we're
I
kind of,
just want to do an
yeah.
interjection there just based on what you were saying. Like, so there's some level of data that's lost because typically, like if you're running a campaign and if you get off of your platform and like it's click 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 to like another platform that you don't own, there is that gap of that data, and then there's the circling back to your platform for the click to purchase. And so are you guys actively trying to solve for that with a plug and play model, or is that piece sometimes still missing?
Well, the piece is still missing. And I'll go into more details on that as well. Like a specific example is, let's say you're running Facebook ads,
Yes.
okay? And someone goes through and they see an ad on Facebook, they scroll over it, they look at it, and then they just keep scrolling. And then let's say a couple hours later, they're on Instagram. They see your ad on Instagram and they scroll over it and they say, hey, I want to make note of that. And then they forget. And the next morning they wake up, oh, yeah, I want to check that thing out. And they go into Google, they Google the name of the business, and they click on the ad and they buy something or they fill out a form.
Mm-hmm.
So the business owner is going to look at that and they're going to see, oh, we have a new customer and it came from Google. But the reality is, did it come from Google?
Mm-hmm.
No, it actually came from Instagram, had an impact, and so did Facebook.
Yeah.
That's a very simplistic explanation of what's going on. But to get even more complicated, what happens when somebody sees an ad on Facebook, they see it on Instagram, they go to your website to check it out, and then they go to Amazon and buy on Amazon?
Yeah.
You're now, as a marketer, you're completely lost. So the only way to solve for that is to use very sophisticated math, because no one has all of that data. It's impossible to string it all together across all of the individual apps, the different devices that someone is coming from. Years ago, when there were no rules on the internet, we could kind of do it. But the walls came up and Amazon said, nobody, if you're part of our marketplace, we can give you limited data, but it's not leaving here. Walmart has done the same thing.
Yeah.
So now we're not living in this, what we call deterministic world, where we know absolutely positively. We're now living in this probabilistic world of math. But the advantage is it's not just math, it's math that then can go back and check itself to see how well it's predicting.
Yeah.
And when you have math that is predicting greater than 90%, you say, okay, these are some odds that I feel comfortable with making some bets on. And that's kind of the world we're living in. So to go back to your question, the way we get around it is we can't. We're thinking outside the box and we're saying, what do we know? What pieces of information do we have that we know we'll always have? Well, what I always know I'll have is I know how much money I spend each day on each platform. I know the hierarchy, the campaign, ad group, keyword, match type, and I know the level of money I spent at that detail. And at that level of detail, I also know how many impressions there were.
Yep.
And so we've built out an impression-centric model, which that allows us to not only put together digital data, but layer it in with linear television, satellite TV, streaming, podcast, digital out of home, direct mail. Everything can come back to impressions. And so we use that as a centralized metric. And then we use very sophisticated math, which interestingly enough, it's actually very old school techniques that are elevated due to how sophisticated the computer chips are today.
Yep.
And that allows us to essentially answer those questions that are not answerable because the data is not available. So it does complete it for us and gives us the best answer.
Yes. And it's still, I think it's understandable to a marketer to kind of like draw that picture out in their minds, but for the non-marketers on the call, give us like the step by step kind of, what you just described, but funnel it down to like very simplistic manners, in terms of, you start here, it ends here, and that's how you kind of are able to witness the entire journey from awareness to purchase.
Yeah, well, it's We essentially, the platform takes in all of those impressions that are in market. So when you think back to how things were before digital, you imagine everything that you're doing that's digital, everything that you're doing that's not digital. Let's even say your SEO. Let's say you have CRM. So every email that goes out, every text message that goes out, we bring in all of this detail, maybe even your organic social. Everything that can be counted comes into this model. It all comes in at a very granular level. It goes into the platform. And then that's when some of we built out some AI just for our platform. Doesn't go out to Chat GPT or anything, does stuff that humans used to do, but now the kind of the machine itself does it on its own. And it goes through and starts to look at the causal relationships between these different impressions that are in market and the different, what we would call your conversion events or your key performance indicators, not just sales, but maybe orders, maybe leads, maybe even website traffic, because sometimes the first indication that things are working is you got more traffic on your website.
Yep.
And it looks for not just that things go up, but it's looking for that incremental rise, meaning what is the amount that you're getting that you wouldn't have gotten if you did this?
Yes.
And then it looks at the inner working relationships between all those individual campaigns and all of the creatives, because there's a couple things that happen in marketing. The first thing is this concept called ad stock. Ad stock is also known as carryover. A good example of that is, let's say you're lucky enough, you have an extra $8 million sitting around as a marketer and you decide to buy a Super Bowl ad.
Yeah.
So what happens the minute your Super Bowl ad goes on? My God, your website traffic goes through the roof. You've never seen traffic that high. And the reality is, if you're not prepared for it, your website will actually crash. That happens every year. But let's say you're prepared for it. Website traffic goes up. The ad is off the air. Guess what? Your traffic is still going to stay high. It's going to stay high for that entire day. So then you would assume the next day it's going to be back down to normal. Nope. It's still going to be in an elevated level because there's still an impact from that TV ad, even though it hasn't aired. It's not airing anymore. And it will take a period of time, sometimes 1 or 2 weeks, for it to actually get back down to what it was before. That is ad stock. It's that lagged long-term impact from an ad. Meaning sometimes an ad, somebody sees an ad, they don't act on it right away. They may act on it a couple of days, a couple hours later. Every ad out there has a potential to have ad stock. Our platform measures it. Another important component is what we call saturation. Saturation is where Google or Facebook or a TV network will keep taking my money.
Yeah.
I can keep spending with Facebook. They'll always take my money. But there's a point at which those ads will not be delivering at the same ratio they were before. Meaning that, let's say before, for every dollar you were spending, you were getting $10 in revenue back. Eventually, maybe you're only getting $8 in revenue back. Maybe you're getting $5.
Yeah.
We want to know where that point is, where the curve starts to go down, because then we want to maybe think about putting our money elsewhere. And then the last piece is this piece called synergy. And that's the idea that when you add, let's say, CTV, connected television, with something like Facebook advertising, you don't just get the power of CTV and Facebook together. Sometimes 1 + 1 actually equals 7. Sometimes a series of ads or creatives and different types of places running simultaneously have this amazing additive effect. So those things together, we calculate all of that.
Yeah.
And then our platform goes through and does simulations where for every single day, it'll remove every single detailed line item. So it can actually calculate all of these total responses. And then we can actually get the actual incremental value that every single line item is causing every single day.
Yeah.
So the output of the platform initially is just a huge series of CSV and Excel files.
Yeah.
Again, it's back to the thing that marketers hate. The output is that. But then that gets put into some sort of visualization platform like a Looker or a Datorama or a Tableau, where you end up with a dashboard that is much more sophisticated than a Google Analytics, because it actually gives you, Google Analytics is great but it's Google's perspective on what's happening. Provalytics gives you essentially a Switzerland perspective on what's going on, because we don't have a horse in the race. It doesn't matter to us. We have a completely independent view, and we call it as we see it.
Yeah.
And so then it provides you the actual who's winning, who's losing, where you should spend your next dollar in order to get your biggest bang for your buck.
Yeah, where to pull the levers and where to kind of inject more spend. Oh, I'm mind blown, Jeff.
Okay.
I mean, this is so sexy. I don't know why you would say that it isn't sexy. It's fantastic in the sense of like, who wouldn't want to know and look behind the scenes and like get that level of detail for their business, especially the business owner who's spending money on the ads, right? You want to make sure you're spending your money where it's worth every nickel and dime. What have been, in terms of building this model, what have been some of the barriers to really, get this to really sink in place? I mean, obviously, every technology goes through like roadblocks. So tell me, let's highlight maybe one of the biggest, pieces that were, you almost felt like, is this really going to work? Is it really going to get to where we want it to get to? I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Well, I always say the biggest roadblock is people.
Yeah.
So I would say that's number one, because, and you hit on this earlier, Sasha, when you talked about how quickly things are changing, and that's a big barrier for a lot of people is change.
Yeah.
And so when we produce something, and we've had multiple versions of this since we've built it out, and we're always improving it. And I always say to our clients that, this is not right. This is a model. All models are wrong. Some are useful. But the concept is that every month we should look that our decisions that we make are less wrong than the decisions we made the month before. So it's always like an iterative process. But one of the big issues about bringing in an advanced measurement like a Provalytics is that we are going to go back
Yeah.
and we are going to look at past decisions. And what ends up happening is people look at that and they're like, oh, God, that's kind of embarrassing now that I did that. And that's a scary thing for some folks that, well, what if my boss sees that that was a mistake that we did 6 months ago? And it's like, yeah, but based upon the data that you had, you didn't know to do that. So that's one thing, is the idea that we're going to go back and maybe I made a mistake in the past. We all make mistakes in the past. That's number one. But the other bigger barrier in building this out, and because that's the people aspect of it, is that some of the indications of the model are contradictory to what people expect. So the model will tell you things and it's like, huh, that
I
doesn't
love
make
that.
sense
I
to
love
me.
that. Yeah.
But my feeling is that if you spend money for an advanced piece of software that's supposed
Yeah.
to deliver insights, and all it does is it goes along with your hunch, then what good is it? It should challenge the norm. And what's interesting for me is that I look back on myself, back into my early days of C3 metrics when I was building out that before in 2008, 2009. And one of the things I didn't like about that back then was dealing with the people aspect and the resistance that people put up to change.
Distance. Yeah.
Yeah, now I love it,
Yeah.
is that aspect. So that's the first thing is,
You have the data to back it up, right? It's not a marketer approaching something by saying this is the direction we need to go in and speaking to CEO, CFO, or anybody in the C-suite where they're like, but why? What do you have to back up the reasoning behind it? And you have that tool to support that conversation, which is huge.
but even if you have the data to back it up, and even though it
So good.
worked, the time that it takes
Mhm.
people to jump on board, like I always say that, every organization wants to have a single source of marketing truth, because once that happens, you're at a nirvana where the finance team is looking at the same set of numbers as you. But the reality is, what's happening in most organizations is that you've got the marketing team that's looking at one set of numbers, like a GA4, let's say they're working with 3 agencies, let's say 4 agencies. Each agency has looking at GA4 and then platform metrics. So what's that? Another 4 sets. So that's 5. Finance is probably looking at something else. That's like 6. And so now there's not a single source. There's 6 to probably 10 different sources of truth. So when finance goes in or marketing goes in to talk to finance, nobody's on the same kind of wavelength. So what you have to go through a series of steps where you get marketing comfortable with it. Then you have to work with their agencies where there's a lot of resistance. And the resistance, and what I explain to people is, listen, you're hiring an agency who hires experts. Like, let's say they're Google experts. They know how to read the tea leaves and the Google platform. And now all of a sudden you're coming in after working with them, let's say for 6 months, and you're saying, ignore Google, follow this. And you're upset that they're not doing it right away. So it takes people time to kind of jump on board and say, hey, I like this. I really enjoy it. It kind of makes sense to me in order to kind of move along. So I'd say that's probably the biggest learnings is that technology is moving so fast that humans are having trouble keeping up. That's the biggest, that's probably the biggest takeaway. And it's kind of like what you talked about earlier, Sasha, that, we have to kind of do our work as marketers we have to do a little homework each week and each month to try to keep up. Because otherwise, if we have our heads down doing just our work every day, we're going to wake up one day and realize that we're really far behind. And these changes to measurement and how we measure and then how we implement these changes, we have to be kind of prepared for it, because the marketing world is shifting in terms of where we place dollars and where those dollars have an impact.
Yeah, no, totally. I completely agree. I mean, it like what you're providing, because I think attribution for the longest time has been available for, to really dig into the crux of that for I would say like mid-sized to larger companies, right? But I still think that with the small businesses and the tech entrepreneurs and the tech startups where they have a limited amount of budget, I'm not saying that mid-sized companies and enterprise companies don't have a set constraint. They do, but there's a little more wiggle room and flexibility versus a startup, who's raised X amount of funds, or like a small business owner that's maybe, dipping into a certain amount of things. And I'm not talking about a couple of $100s, but we're talking about a threshold that would be worth it for them to tap into Provalytics. Now, is the platform built for an ease of use for an owner that maybe has a little bit of understanding in terms of marketing to be able to understand how to plug and play this? Or is it only set up to be able to be supported by a marketer in conjunction with working with their clients and business owners?
Yeah, we built it out primarily for the market that I know really well, which is the enterprise market.
Yes.
But you do talk about an underserved market, which is really like the SMB market and the smaller marketers. But there are things that those folks can do to get a better handle on what's happening and kind of borrow some of our secret sauce, if you will.
Yeah.
And really what it comes down to is that, the last 2 decades of digital marketing have primarily been focused on the click. And that's what everyone focuses on, because the click is right close to the sale, or it's right close to the lead form.
Yes.
And what's happened is that we now have a whole generation of marketers who believe that this is how marketing works, that we invest dollars to buy clicks and clicks lead to sales. But the reality is that the way marketing actually functions is we invest dollars to buy eyeballs or attention. And we call that, in marketing speak, impressions. We actually buy media impressions. That leads to awareness. And when awareness is built up to a certain point, people will walk into our store. And for most of us, our store is online. So that is what leads to clicks, which then leads to sales. And so, but what ends up happening is that as marketers and small business owners, most people are just hyper focused on the actual sales. So we focus on what's driving clicks. And going back to the example we talked about before, where people see an ad on Facebook, they see it on Instagram, and then the next day somebody Googles my name and clicks on the Google ad. And so as a small business owner, I invest more money in Google, which is what Google wants. But so because what ends up happening is that I cut my budget in Facebook and then I get fewer clicks. So the thing to do for marketers is they need to be focused on impressions. And the way to do that is look at that Google sheet that you have. Every marketer has it. It's a sheet for usually like the last 12 months. Every day you put in there how many visits you had to your website, how many sales or leads you had, and how much money you spent. And you've got your cost per click, your cost per sale. What you need to do is a little bit of homework. You need to go backwards. You first need to add an extra column right next to date, call it impressions, and go back to Facebook, go back to Google, and now download all those same reports, but now include the column you omitted before, which is impressions. And now what you want to do is you now want to create a graph that looks at the last 12 months every day, how many impressions you had per day, how many clicks you had per day, and then how many conversions, sales or leads or whatever you had. And you'll start to see some interesting relationships. You'll start to see days where your impressions went up and you won't see clicks go up, but then you'll see clicks go up maybe a couple days, maybe even a week later, and then sales go up even further. Yeah. So now when you see that there's that relationship, you want to dig into those days and see, what did I do on those days? What campaign was running? What offer was running? And then repeat those. So the key takeaway is that the metric you want to use to determine how you should spend your dollars is not the click. The click is the result of what you're doing.
Yes.
You're spending your dollars at the impression. And the only way you know that is going back to what you said earlier, Sasha, which is data.
Yes.
Data is king in a business. And for small business owners are just like myself and you. They're entrepreneurs. And one of the things that we suffer from as an entrepreneur is that we have such a positive outlook on things. We never want to look at the data because I already know how it's going. And I don't want to look at the numbers because maybe the numbers go against what my head tells me things are. But the numbers are what guide your head. And if you look at the right numbers, you'll know better where to make those decisions. So for SMB or for startups, as long as they are using impressions to guide their business, they'll be guided down the right path. It's just a little bit more work, but they can do it on their own. I call it the DIY approach.
Yeah, no, that was super helpful to kind of break that down. And I love that you talk about that they need to be focusing on impressions, because a lot of the times people just say, oh, impressions is a fluff number. They do away with the impressions, but it really is the connections of all the different KPIs that you're looking at to be able to calculate at the end whether something was successful or not. And I also love that you mentioned that, you know, visits to the site could be the beginnings of something working and not necessarily only focusing on the end goal of a purchase, right? Because as we all know, or maybe we don't, as you know, for the business owners on this call, is that it takes multiple times for somebody to interact with your product and interact with your service or interact with how they're seeing you and where they're seeing you to then have that conversion. It's like a couple of years ago, Google came out with like the customer journey is no longer linear. It's the messy middle, because it's not just radio, TV, you know, digital ads. It's maybe going to a concert, you know, somebody has a drink that they're sponsoring there. Your first impression is at a concert, or you're having coffee with somebody, somebody's telling you about a product or a service that they had. And there's so many more avenues for you to have a touch point with that company before you actually purchase. So I do love the focus on the KPIs of the data before that is the lead up to the sale, and not just only hone in on how many sales did we get and did we not get any sales and so on.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really the key. Is you could say that website visits, I mean, there's different philosophies. Marketing is typically held responsible for all sales, but when you think about it, if we use the retail analogy, once someone gets to the site, that's the same as them walking into the store.
100%.
Once someone gets inside the store, it's a different department. It's merchandising, whose job it is to arrange things on the shelf to get people to buy it. You could kind of say that, well, once they're on the site, then it's the job of the site to sell, and that's where you come into conversion rate optimization. That's where you start to experiment with button colors and things like that. People say, well, what kind of difference could a button color have? Button color can have a huge difference with whether someone fills out a form or not. It's massive. But obviously, first, you just need to have enough traffic to the site to get people to click the buttons. And then you start working on that.
Yeah, and I love that you say the visit to the site is like somebody walking into a store. I'm sure anyone has done what site visits do, where it's like you look at the site data where it's, time spent, that particular piece, right? I have walked into a store just because I was attracted by the outside windows. I've walked in and I'm like, yeah, this isn't for me. And I said, thank you very much. And I've walked out, right? So that time spent could have literally been 30 seconds, which is what happens on a site. So you're right. That synergy is very similar. And to think about people's behavior on and offline that's a nice synergy. And so thank you for bringing that up, because we tend to forget about that with how everything is online today.
And also think about it as well. When we think about it just online, if you're in e-commerce, you think about people coming to your store, like let's say your Shopify store. Well, you also got to remember that walking into your store would be someone visiting your product page on Amazon, or your product page on Target.com or Walmart.com. Or if you're a B2B company, someone coming to your website is the same to going to a review site, or visiting your LinkedIn page, or Googling you and seeing what comes up. So you have to start stepping back further and start looking at, am I saying the same thing about my product on my website as I am on Amazon, as they are on Walmart? Is there consistency there? For certain products, especially B2B, it really matters more than anything else, but B2C, it's important as well too. So all of those, that experience is really important. What's troubling, what's difficult though, is that for marketers, if you're in the e-commerce world, you really only have a lot of control over the whole website experience. The stuff that shows up on your Walmart page, your Target or Amazon pages essentially comes from a feed.
Yeah.
It's a photo and a description, and that's pretty much it. So there's not a lot to optimize there, but you just have to be aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, I love this piece of the conversation. It's really important to remember, because I think that data is supportive of, discovering that product market fit, right? I mean, and
Right.
you're working with enterprises, it's the same with working with a tech startup, because enterprises are completely and always like evolving and renewing and creating new products, creating new service. So in essence, they are operating like a tech startup within an enterprise company. And it doesn't mean just because they have a following that each product or service that they launch is going to be a hit. So with
Right.
finding that product market fit, having the data support that is super important.
1,000%.
Yeah. So Jeff, this has been super informative, and like I'd love to continue to dive in, but I do want to leave the audience with, and on both sides, like I want to talk about the marketers and the business owners. What are three things that a marketer and a business owner should be thinking about as it relates to marketing? And which basically, for the marketer standpoint, it dives into like why you started Provalytic, but then at the same time, what a business owner or somebody sitting on a C-suite level in an enterprise company should be thinking about, when data is presented to them, so at a high level, like to understand, what the marketers are doing.
Well, I think one of the first things you want to start to think about is, looking at the mix of where we're spending. Even though Google has talked about how, the sales funnel is kind of dead, it's a circular type motion, but still there is a funnel, if you will, in terms of visualizing, we can think about it. There is that
There's
path.
that through line with the circle around that through line.
Exactly. And what I would want to know as an executive or business owner is, just give me a simple breakdown and a guesstimate of what percentage of money am I spending at the top of the funnel, where we're trying to acquire people who aren't aware of us to drive them through. And that's important, because we're spending today for dollars maybe 6 months from now, 9 months, or a year from now, depending upon how long our sales cycle is. So that's because if you're only spending dollars in the bottom part of the funnel, you're going to be more subject to market conditions. As advertising rates go up, more competition comes up. Since this is like a bid type environment, your marketing costs are going to go up dramatically, and you don't have anything in the reserve. So you want to make sure that you're spending something in that upper part of the funnel. Whatever that amount is, it should be something. It should be at least a quarter of your marketing dollars should be up there. So that's the
And
first
to keep it
question.
running.
Right, because you want to always have it there. Now, sometimes it feels like, well, we should cut that because I don't see the return for it today, but that's very short thinking. Okay. And C-suite folks, yes, they're hyper focused on this quarter, but you're always in the middle of a quarter. So you should always be thinking about the next quarter. So that at least gets you thinking ahead. So we need to be always thinking forward. So that's that first piece is that. The second question is, how are we going to know when those dollars actually pay off? How are we measuring so that we know it's actually going to work? So you want to make sure there's a framework in place, some sort of measure framework. So you know that, for example, if you're a small business owner and you're sponsoring a kids' little league team and your banner is up, in the middle of town where everybody drives by 3 times a day, so you can start to think about maybe 10% of the population drives by every day, multiply those numbers up. How many impressions are those? You could add that to your same sheet. You start to think about, how will I know that that's actually paying off? And what are the methods that I'll know that it's actually a worthwhile investment besides it's just a charity type of
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah.
So that would be the second piece. So the first one is, what percentage is at the top of the funnel? How are we effectively measuring it? And then the third piece is, regardless of what you're selling or what you're doing in marketing today, you're buying ads to get a return in some place. But we now know that in everything that's being sold, there's different places for consumers to engage. There's different places for consumers to purchase. And so, how do we measure what we would call the halo? How do we determine if I'm spending dollars on TV that's supposed to be driving people to the website, because we actually say the website name 18 times in the ad, but it's actually driving people to Amazon and to Walmart? How do we know that?
Yeah.
Because that's important so that we don't actually stop doing something that's actually driving sales. So those would be the three most important things. What percentage are we spending in that top part of the funnel? How do we know? How will we know when it's working? And how do we determine that halo from that we're spending in one place, but it's actually having an impact elsewhere?
Yeah. Wow, that's great. Thank you for combining those. I love it. Thank you so much, Jeff. This has been so rich, so insightful, and this is we're just touching the tip of the iceberg here. So, would love to have you back on to talk in more detail about data and how the landscape is changing. So, you know, congratulations on Provalytics and the journey that you've had leading up to this. I think that it's going to continue, because as we grow through the unknowns of AI and everything else that's going to start popping up one day as it relates to marketing. I think data, just similar to how video is king for content, data is king for making the chess moves that you do, and within your business to continue and keep growing.
Absolutely, Sasha. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Love to come back anytime.
Thank you so much.